Hey, folks, James Abrinio coming to you on James Pod. Senator Salim here. I don't know if you know, Senator, but you're actually my first actual guest onto this podcast. So I thank you for coming on, and I really appreciate your time.
No, it's an honor to just be a guest on your show. I appreciate you having me on, and to be the first guest, it's an honor as well.
Yeah, and Senator, the point of this, I'm a practicing attorney here in Northern Virginia. With everything going on across the river, I'm losing my mind. I said, let's see if we can figure out a way to focus on Northern Virginia. And obviously, there's a lot going on here, unfortunately, because of the administration. But before we get there, for folks that don't know you or know you that well, can you just introduce yourself a little bit? What do you do? And just walk us through, and I'll ask some more specific questions. So,
Yeah. So again, thanks for having me. I'm State Senator Saddam Salim. I represent Senate District 37th, which is as far as Tyson's, Oakton, Vienna, and then all the way out to the Eden Center and everything in between. So really, central Fairfax, and it's in Fairfax. There's about 22 state legislators in combination, and I just happen to be one of those. My background is really, I'm a federal contractor who focuses on essentially financial statements and policies in the finance side. And I've worked for the U.S. Institute of Peace. I've worked for a couple of the other agencies in between as a federal contractor. And the story really goes back to 1998. There was a flood in Bangladesh where it kind of wiped out majority of my town, and we went from hundreds of people to really just in the double digits. And that really got my dad to think about, what do I do for my kids? We're here rather than later on in life, and he got an opportunity to bring us to America. And in the summer of 2000, we get to America, and immediately a year into it, the apartment complex gets sold to a investor who decides that they're going to turn it into a luxury condo uh, unit. And it's not just my family; it's 6, 7 other families who are immigrants as well, who did not understand the letter they received, and ended up where we were all on a Friday afternoon, just around noon, on the sidewalks, just waiting, not sure what happened. And I was 10 at that time, so I didn't really speak English besides just the basics, and didn't know what was happening. But fast forward, folks in Virginia takes us in, and they really, extend their hands, extend their generosity, and says, "Look, we want to help you out, get you out of that." We apply for low-income housing in Fairfax County, and it takes us about 2, 3 years to get that. While we're waiting, we're staying in people's basements and here and there. And it's really that generosity. And I really talk about that part because without random strangers, whether they're, immigrants or Americans or whoever at that moment, without their generosity, I would not be here where I am today.
mm,
And my only way of giving back to them and the community was really to run for office, do something different, whether it's public education, affordable housing, or just gun violence prevention. I said, "Look, I'm not a millionaire. I can't give money." So I decided to run for office and really put a lot of my time and effort and beat out a 16-year incumbent, where he spent closer to a little bit over $1 million, versus my less than $190,000. In reality, it was 150. But that is really the story of somebody coming from another country, really calling this a home, not because I wanted this to be my home, but because of the people along the way. And the generosity that they have shown is the real reason why I fight for George Mason. I fight for gun violence prevention, housing, and all that, so that I can, one day leave and say, "Look, we put in policies that are going to impact a lot of other lives." And my story is not simply my story. It's a lot of immigrants who come here. They immediately think America's the greatest place on earth. You're going to be wealthy. You're going to be taken care of, only to find themselves on the street. And that's the forgotten story we don't talk about. And I thought, why not showcase that? And in that part, I got accepted into a 4-year university with essentially a full ride scholarship, but turned that down because my mom got sick, and really ended up going to Northern Virginia Community College, did the 2-year guaranteed admission, and ended up at George Mason. And I talked about that in my campaign trail. And the number of people whose parents came up to me or the students came up and said, I just learned about this through you. How do I do this? And I said, look, this is a program that Northern Virginia Community College has had for years. And a lot of students during my campaign who volunteered on my campaign ended up doing that. So I felt something that benefited me is now benefiting thousands of other people as a result of my conversation. So it was really good to see all of that. And again, I go back to the generosities of the universities, the localities, the people, and everyone has really shaped and influenced what I do today. And that's really to sum up my story.
Yeah, and look, I got to say, I was paying pretty close attention. I know Chap Peterson. I know how competitive that race was, and it's truly impressive how well you did on that. And he was a longtime senator. Towards that time, he kind of made a change, which is surprising as far as his politics. And I think that you represented the progressive change that I think folks like me were inspired by. I'll also tell you, my dad was an immigrant from the Philippines, and he met my mom in Southern Virginia. As a fellow first generation, what you went through is and able to do at this young of an age is inspiring to me. I mean, just seeing what you did and how you adapted. I mean, it's the American dream. So again, I just appreciate your efforts and willing to serve. And the amount of time, and I don't think people understand the amount of time and effort it requires. I mean, how many months are you down in Richmond just to serve during session?
They classify this as a part-time job. We're down in Richmond between January through February on odd years, and on even years, which is a long one, which is 60 days. So we're there until mid-March, sometimes towards the end of March, and that's our part-time 3 months, 2 months, and then we have to have a daytime job on top of that in order to make ends meet. But between that and the off season, we're in commissions, boards that we sit on that meet in the middle of the day. So I got to drive down to Richmond maybe once a week just to go to these meetings. Or if I had a bill that went into a study that another committee's hearing, I have to be present for some of those just to make sure the right conversations are being heard. So it is, I'm gonna be honest, it is a full-time job. The full-time job has now become the part-time job, is what we're noticing. And I think, originally this is intended this way because, 100 years ago, 100 plus years ago, you had electeds who were farmers, who were folks that needed to take at least 2-3 days just to get to Richmond in a horse buggy or just in a horse. The times have changed now. So I think that's where the General Assembly, the structure of itself has not updated to the 21st century yet. And I think that's where we're headed in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and at some point I'll have you back on to talk about your views on having a full-time legislature, which I think only is the only thing that makes sense. I mean, but the subject, the reason I wanted to bring you on today is what's happening with George Mason. I'm a UVA graduate, but I live right beside George Mason. And so I'm seeing what's happening, and I happen to see a post that you did with a couple other senators, including Pekarsky. And I wanted to, you're a graduate of George Mason. So first of all, talk about how important George Mason was to you. And you already referenced it, but then talk to me about, help us understand like what's happening for folks that are not in the know, that are just trying to go about their lives. What's happening, George Mason?
Yeah, it is really, the Trump administration has gone on, I don't want to say it's a witch hunt, but that's what it is. They have gone on a lot of these institutions, and we saw UVA, and we're now seeing George Mason, where they realized, hey, the President Trump wants to get rid of DEI. He's understanding it that it's benefiting certain folks and not the folks that he wants it to benefit. So what does he do? He attacks our educational institutions who receive federal grants and funding. And we saw with UVA where President Ryan retired, or at least left his post and resigned because of the investigation that the DOJ was doing to ensure that, hey, the methods of how you got to getting rid of DEI while it's still there. We want to do a full investigation. And by the way, if you don't cooperate, we're going to take away a lot of the grants that the universities rely on. So now, now because they got a victory at UVA, which Governor Youngkin has said, same thing with AG Mieres has said, we're just going to leave the door open and let the federal government come in and do what they need to do. And by the way, once you're done, just close the door and we'll be full supportive. We won't resist. Now, what has happened to George Mason is that the Department of Education, specifically their Office of Civil Rights, has opened two separate investigations. One is they're looking at Dr. Washington, President Gregory Washington, at his hiring and promotion policies. They're essentially saying is that diversity, inclusion initiatives were used in order to make the hires that the Dr. Washington wanted to do through the use of diversity, and some of these candidates are not qualified, and they really wanted to do an investigation of how that was done, who was hired, and this really goes down to the fact that Dr. Washington went out and said, "Hey, look, we're going to go and change the department's name so that it does comply with the with what the federal government has asked us to do, especially Trump, under an executive order." Now, the executive orders are just directives; they're not actual laws. The second part of this is that let me actually go back to the first one. Dr. Washington, or President Washington, who changed the name that was Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Office, and he basically renamed it to Office of Access, Compliance, and Community, so that he can say, look, our universities are complying with the executive orders that the president has handed down. And you saw Cornell, you saw Yale, you saw all the major universities who essentially just bend the knee and said, we're going to follow. And President Washington thought, hey, this is a good idea. Without harming the university, I think we could do it the right way and still be in compliant. And the administration has come out and said, look, you are not doing this the right way. We want to open up an investigation, essentially to find cause to get rid of President Washington. And I think, I'm just gonna go out and say it. You'll notice President Washington is a Black American who has worked through the ranks, who has done a lot of good things in the universities that he's worked with, and has brought all that talent to George Mason to take it, to uplift a lot of the rankings where we were frankly low in those rankings, and has brought it up significantly. Well, the second part of this investigation is that the DOJ is saying during the Gaza Israel issue that took place under Title V, they're opening an investigation around the fact that they're alleging that George Mason failed to effectively respond to a hostile environment for Jewish students and faculties. Now, you'll notice there was a lot of protests in different universities, in different parts, even our private universities, not only in Virginia, but also throughout the country and throughout the world. And the administration has said, we're going to go ahead and use the Israel-Gaza conflict as a way and really run this as anti-Semitism and really attack the universities and get people that are aligned with some of the policies they want to carry. Now, what's happening is that who gets to make those decisions are the Board of Visitors, and the presidents are the ones that will enact on the directions of the Board of Visitors. And I think that's the next thing that we're going to be leading into, is that the governor of Virginia appoints all the Board of Visitors. We as the Senate, especially Privilege and Elections Committee, we will get those nominations, we will vet them and say, these nominations are good, we're going to move them forward. Whether it's a Republican governor or a Democratic governor, the committee has always done their due diligence and said the purposes of these boards are to look out for the best interest of the Commonwealth of those universities, not necessarily to say politically we're going to align one-sided or not. When you have a Republican governor, we know the members are going to be conservatives that are appointed. When you have a Democratic governor, The Republicans know that there's going to be some folks that are liberal that are going to get nominated. In that process, what has happened is that the governor realized he doesn't have enough of the board members that could support some of the things that he's going to be doing. He's going to be essentially proxy for the Trump administration. It ends up where he appoints some of these members that are a bit too extreme for these universities. And Privilege and Elections Committee, I sit as a member. We decided, hey, we're going to go ahead and once the nominations gets to us, we will go ahead and deny those nominations. We will not confirm them or move them forward. And effectively, what that's supposed to do is ensure that those members do not sit temporary or permanently until the governor appoints new people. And that is how the process works. That has worked before my time in the Senate. That has worked last year. So this year, the governor decided, hey, we're not going to follow the Privilege and Elections Committee. We prefer that the full Senate and the full House determine whether these members could sit. So I think that's what we're seeing, is that the George Mason fight is really the governor saying, I don't have enough folks on the board. I just need a few more in order to cooperate with DOJ to say, hey, look, we're going to go ahead and squash this issue that you have by removing the president of the university.
And I did see, so you, along with Senator Lucas and some other senators, have filed suit in the Fairfax Circuit Court. I can attach the complaint to the show notes here for anybody interested. Well written. And by the way, if you can't speak on active litigation, feel free to tell me to stop asking. But in it, folks will see that essentially it's in the state constitution that the governor appoints, that the General Assembly will, the governor appoints, and then the General Assembly has the say-so about approvals. And if it's not through the process, action beyond that is unconstitutional. So let me just understand what logistically is happening as we're sitting here today. So the governor has appointed board members. The P&E rejected it. And so now he's called for a full vote in the entire General Assembly, or where are we actually at right now?
So the governor is basically saying, and then again, I'll talk briefly to the extent of the public information that's available. The governor is essentially saying C&E has rejected these nominations. He does not think that that is where it stops. He feels the full Senate and the full House must vote on them for this to be fully rejected. And as a result of these members could temporarily sit on the Board of Visitors. And we're saying the Constitution is straightforward in what it says. If you reject them in phase one, they're not going to move forward at all. So that's what the extent of the clarification in the lawsuit is. And that's the extent that I can talk about it, given that it's a litigation that's happening. But I'm glad you were able to bring some shed some light into this, because it is important. And the reason for that is, you'll notice President Trump will challenge every single thing that's in the Constitution until he takes it to the Supreme Court. And now we have a sort of Trump-light version in Virginia. That's what really I want people to see, is that we also have some of the Governor Youngkin, who was quoted to be a moderate, but has now fully become a MAGA supporter, who is saying, look, you tried at the federal level, let me tinker with the state level and see what happens.
Yeah, and it's super frustrating. Do you know if there's a trial date for the actual litigation, or I guess if you can comment on it, maybe you can't. Yeah.
From my understanding is that they're still determining, the county's still determining when that would be, and that's the extent that I know and the lawyers know. And they keep us pretty updated, so that's as far as I can.
Certainly,
I've been informed.
And you may not be able to speak on this. Jim Ryan was obviously ultimately said, you know what, I'm not fighting it. Do you have any sense of whether President Washington will be, whether or not legally, but essentially be in a position where he has to resign? Or I guess you probably don't even have any sense of that right now, right?
I don't. And again, I think a lot of it is going to be determined by the current board. I know I get about 20 to 30 emails every single day to say, hey, can you do something about this? Can you call the board members? And that's why I said, hey, look, we can do something. Let's get all the George Mason alumni who are in the General Assembly. So We reached out to both groups of Democrats and Republicans and said, I'm thinking of doing something. Uh, if you all want to be part of that, we want to protect our institution that we came from. As alumni, we have the obligation to do this. And I think you'll notice only a small number of them responded. And, Senate Democrats were all fully ready to go, and we sent it out as that way. And I honestly don't know which way it's going to go. I think regardless of whether somebody was right or wrong, that they should cooperate with DOJ investigations. And if you're truly saying, "Hey, look, I'm innocent of what I'm being accused of," let the legal system do its thing, and Dr. Washington and the university does get their own legal representation, along with the AG also represents them in a different capacity. So again, I leave it up to the court to see what ends up happening. But do they decide? Does the board decide, hey, they want to get rid of Dr. Washington? I think that would be a terrible mistake if they do that, because they're not allowed to say they're going to cut a deal. And not that I think they're going to, but a lot of times these things happen where we don't go to litigation. We get the solution done early, and sometimes it happens where somebody has to be the scapegoat and let go.
Yeah.
And we saw that UVA where Jim Ryan decided, hey, for the best interest of the university, he's going to resign so that the grants and the programs and other things don't immediately come to a halt as a result of the actions that his office is taking. So I honestly don't know what's going to happen with George Mason. I do know that the board is meeting at the end of this month, and that they're going to be going through the process and the procedures. And Dr. Washington did send out a sort of updated statement a couple of days ago on what he understood the cases to be and what his team is doing, and who he has hired and all that. And I think it's public knowledge that, and we saw it in the news, that the former AG Bill Barr's law firm was hired.
What?
By the
Mike
Department of
Pompeo is
Justice.
over there, by the way, too. I saw, I think Senator Serval had tweeted something about it, or maybe Bluesky. I don't go on Twitter as much anymore, but can you even? I assume you can't comment on that. I will. If you can't, then I'm saying what the hell.
I won't be able to comment on it, but you're free to comment.
Yeah, I mean, it's just remarkable how, first of all, how closely tied everything is. But if you're worried about, because the rector, I think, was the one that you are challenging, one of the people you were challenging in your lawsuit that was approved, and he's the one who hired Bill Barr. Maybe I'm misreading that. But it's just remarkable to see it. I can tell you as a lawyer, seeing what our attorney general, how political he's made that office, and just how litigation is going down in general, it's just really, really disheartening. As far as Mieres's play in all of this, do you have any information? I guess he's just sitting by the sidelines and just saying, let's see what happens. And,
I do believe that, he's in a position where he's either lame duck, or he sees this as an opportunity to say, I could use this to stay in office for another 4 years. And I think that's what he's doing, is he's saying, if I don't fight back and I continue to talk, and he continues to say, this is about DEI, this is about the executive order and how George Mason has failed to do their duties under that EO, he doesn't have an obligation to protect the universities, but he does have an obligation to comply with federal executive orders. And by doing that, he's going to get a lot of the MAGA base, a lot of the Trump base that are going to support him. So he's looking at this from a political point of view to say, what is in his best interest to save his job? Again, I don't know the extent that his team has responded or not. That's a litigation that the lawyers are working on, and I won't comment on that. But I think overall, Mears is looking at this from a political perspective, not from the perspective of saving flagship universities in the Commonwealth. If that was the case, he could have, represented Jim Ryan at UVA. He could have lent his hands and his office to George Mason as well. And they're going to try to chip away two of the biggest flagship universities in Virginia. And it's going to send a signal and a message to all the other universities is that you either comply or we're going to replace whoever's in charge with somebody else that will get us to comply.
Mhm.
And by the way, we have our AG's office and the legal side on our end. And that's part of our lawsuit, along with really sending a message to say we as Democrats are going to fight back. We will do what is right versus what is wrong. And a lot of times, and I'm going to be honest about this, um, sometimes, I'm in session, I'm wherever I go in thinking this is the best right thing until I get there and I see a different perspective and I say, you know what, I was wrong and I'm willing to admit that. So how do we move forward with this so that it works for, other folks outside of my district or the whole Commonwealth? And a lot of times you have to swallow those pills because you're working for the state.
Yeah.
You are not working for yourself. Your job is to ensure you're the stewardship for the Commonwealth.
Yeah, and I, and I'm gonna try not to rant too much about our attorney
Yeah.
general, but number one, this is the reason it's so important for people up here in Northern Virginia to pay attention to our elections. We've got one coming up in November. Obviously, Spanberger's on the top of the ticket, but for me, the most important race is that attorney general spot. And Mieres, in my view, is a lawyer. You are hired to represent a client. In my job, it's my individual clients as the representative of our Commonwealth to essentially, in my view, put politics and personal ambition over representing our community is just absurd. I mean, even, not a word spoken against this big, beautiful bill and how it's going to gut Medicaid recipients, how our universities are great institutions. I mean, the ability, Virginia has some of the best universities in the country, and to allow just a purely political play and our AG is going to be silent on it is just really, really frustrating. I mean, the AG's office for lawyers, we depend on non-political guidance, like legal ethics opinions. And it's hard for me to trust anything that's coming out of that office when it is so political. And I'll stop with my rant. But everybody that's watching this, make sure to get out in November because it's not just the governorship and the LG that's important. The AG run is so important as well. Sorry about that. The other you mentioned about protests and how they're using anti-Semitism to essentially go against and really kind of take out university leadership. Let me ask you, because I wasn't really paying attention to George Mason in all the protests that were going on. Was there a lot of protests on campus regarding Gaza?
There was a small number of protests
Yeah.
where I saw it from other folks that were there through Facebook and through social media.
Yeah.
There was some at VCU, UVA, and other institutions. But I think at George Mason, a lot, Dr. or President Washington and the universities have said, we're going to let the students protest. They're not harming other students. But you get one incident where, there may have been a clash. And that is what the focus is, that out of the couple of days of protest, nothing happened, but that 2 seconds of a clash, that's what we want to focus on. And I think that's what's really happening here. And, every student, whether it's a student or you're not in the universities, ever since I can remember, my family came here in the early 2000s. I remember this is a country where if you don't like something, you go out and you protest. We saw with some of the wars before in the 70s, folks have protested, and that's a constitutional right. And the goal is to ensure that there's peaceful protest. You're not infringing on someone else's constitutional right. And the moment you do that, that's when, I do believe someone should be arrested or someone should be in trouble as a result of your actions are causing someone else's infringement on someone else's constitutional rights. That's where a lot of us will, make sure that we draw the line because we all believe in the Constitution and it is fundamentally everyone's right to protest in that aspect. So they're going to be using that as a way, and they did that with Columbia, they did that with Cornell and other universities where they're using the protest and to say, you're not protecting Jewish students, you're not protecting students that are at these universities. And the whole, Israel-Palestine and the anti-Semitism issue, it is a generational fight now where you see a shift in two different generations, where they're going to look at this and say, look, we don't feel certain things are happening to us, or this is not a fight. This is a fight that took place, you know, like about 60, 70 years ago before our time, and we would like to get to a different solution. And I think that's what's happening around the country, is that the use of anti-Semitism, where I've seen a lot of folks in terms of my district where I talk to folks and they're afraid, hey, look, when these things happen, our synagogues, our churches, our mosque, or whatever it may be, a place of worship, they always get vandalized. And my number one goal is to ensure that they get the proper security, because everyone should be able to go worship, feel safe, and not feel that somebody's going to attack them. But to weaponize that, to say, look, we're going to take what's happening and weaponize that, to say that's going to be the face of everything that we're going to be doing, that's an excuse to allow them to go through um, having the tough conversation with different communities and really powering through the goals that they want to achieve, which is really, in this case, how do I get rid of the university president so they can align with some of my policies and not some of the so-called, as some of the conservatives will call it, liberal or woke policies.
It's interesting, and I think I messaged you about this as we were trying to set this up. I'm a big fan of the New York Times daily podcast. I don't know if you're a listener, but they had on they had a story, I think last Wednesday, and it talked about kind of an offshoot of Project 2025, and they called it Project Esther, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. But essentially, the Heritage Foundation, led by a non-Jewish leadership, their goal was to essentially use anti-Semitism to essentially reshape higher education. And it seems very obvious what's happening. What I can't help thinking about is Charlottesville and Trump's, beautiful people on both sides, or I forgot the phrase he used, but he both sides what was happening in Charlottesville and Unite the Right. And that, Jews will not replace us, and statements like that. You have Stephen Miller calling Charlottesville a hoax. I mean, he literally is calling it the Charlottesville hoax now. It's just the irony is dead. It would be laughable if it wasn't tragic. I don't know what else to say. Now, you obviously been paying attention to what's happening as far as ICE immigration enforcement. And by the way, I've got you over 30 minutes now, so feel free to cut me off whenever. I could keep you on all day. Any thoughts on immigration and what's happening here? You're one of our leaders now. Any thoughts on what we should be doing to help, whether it's education, immigration, that kind of thing? Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. I think a lot of so I look at this from a different perspective, as somebody who comes from the immigrant world, as somebody who knows people who are here, who are seeking asylum, who are here, who are in the DACA program, and a lot of different silos. So to see what ICE is doing, whether it's the courtroom or a place where you have a heavy number of immigrants, in my district, right next to it, Seven Corners, apartment complexes, and then Annandale. Those are the places where a lot of immigrants live, and they're getting raided every other day. But the reality of a lot of these immigrant policies that the president wants to do, it is really, how does he control Americans? How does he control the people that are here? And I carried certain bills the first time I ran, or I was in the Senate, my year one. I carried a bill to change our misdemeanor code to 364 days rather than 365 days, so that we don't trigger a data sharing or informational sharing that goes out to ICE if a immigrant or somebody who who committed something that required a misdemeanor one, to avoid somebody from getting deported or somebody who's waiting in the system. And people saw that as, I'm pro-immigrant. I want criminals all over the roads. If somebody committed a crime, they're going to go to the court system. They're just going to determine what the fines are and what they have to serve. But with immigration right now, what is really happening is that it has become the secret police for the Trump administration to say, go out there. Remember, they started the first phase of this as we have a lot of gang members, we have a lot of criminals on the street who are going to be harming our communities, and people were like, let's do it, let's get rid of them. And then they realized, by the way, we don't think there's enough criminals on the street that are coming from the immigrant communities that are undocumented. So how do we find the next phase? Let's go and attack everyone that has some type of criminal record or somebody who's showing up to the courtrooms. So from a state's perspective, it is really not only hurting our court system, but it's also hurting our economy. It's also hurting folks that are actually taxpayers in the Commonwealth of Virginia to the United States of America. And what we're seeing is anyone that can put on a mask, that could wear jeans and a white shirt, could come up to you and say, I'm with ICE, you're arrested. That is the definition of kidnapping. And whether you're consenting or not, that is a different story. But the definition of kidnapping is where we're at right now. And we saw this in Chesterfield. We saw this in Prince William County and in Fairfax County courts, where they're essentially waiting. As soon as the judge says gavel down, you're going to have to come back for your hearing in about 2 weeks, or we determine that your paperwork is going to get denied. They're coming out, and mind you, they went in there not for immigrant issues. They went there to pay a traffic ticket or something else, but because they're an immigrant, you're getting arrested for that. So the Commonwealth, at least I am looking at, how do we ensure that folks that are going into our court system, whether it's a divorce case, whether it's a civil matter, whatever it may be, that they can come back out, walk to their car, feel safe, and go home. And there's a thing that a lot of people miss in all of this, is that if you're going to the court system with a piece of paper saying, hey, I got a fine or I committed a crime and I want to know what the punishment for this is, they're not breaking the law. They're saying, I broke the law and I understand what's happening. I want to be a law-abiding citizen, so I'm showing up to pay the fines. And you're saying those are the folks that are criminals. So what the Trump administration is trying to do is they're trying to turn every immigrant to say they're criminals. They're the reason why crime is high. And I think the state has an obligation to protect our court system, to protect people's civil rights, liberties, and to really say to the Trump administration, it's not going to happen in my Commonwealth. But our biggest problem right now is the AG's office and the governor's office, who could do something and say, you can't come in here. We have the 287G ICE cooperation that a lot of our state agencies, a lot of our sheriff's office will have, which allows them to cooperate with ICE without any other state regulations. And I think we're basically seeing the Commonwealth of Virginia is the door is open, go and commit crimes. We're going to look the other way. On your way, just close the door and we'll pretend this never happened while you're committing crimes and terrorizing thousands of people along the way. And that's a failure on the governor and the AG.
You know, and with this administration, Mieres in particular, I oftentimes see they will take advantage of, criminal cases. And in my view, and it's a cynical play. And in a lot of ways, they're taking advantage of victims, right? So you have a victim of a crime, and instead of, letting the system process it, letting the victim be involved, they're essentially bragging about it and using victims as, reason for their own political push. The irony, of course, I'm in criminal courts a lot. I do domestic violence cases. You have victims that are non-citizens. They're afraid to come into court because they're witnesses, but they're worried about getting picked up by ICE. There's also this little thing called the presumption of innocence, right? I represent a lot of folks that are factually guilty, right? And to think that they're going to be going out of their way to make sure that they're not going to be fugitives, they're going to listen to summonses, they're going to listen to subpoenas, they're going to try to address the issue and then pick them up before they've even been convicted. I mean, it's absurd. And again, I hate to go on my rant. A friend and I actually recently went to a local immigration court because I don't do immigration work. I was just curious what was happening. And, a lot of what's happening in immigration court is setting status dates. And this lady was informed by the judge at that hearing that her husband had been detained and he was voluntarily self-deporting, so giving up his family. And the only thing she has to ask the question to the judge is, am I going to get picked up when I go outside the door? And the judge, not being a jerk, just trying to be honest, like, I don't have the information. So the goal with this administration is just to terrify the hell out of people so they're going to self-deport. I mean, it's really that simple, that cynical, and frankly, that racist. I mean, you don't have to say it, I'll say it. So I saw, again, I don't want to take you too long. I saw your opinion piece on AI, and the big, beautiful bill ended up taking off regulation on AI. While I got you here, what's your thoughts on, like, what should the legislatures be looking at when concerning AI? And I'm talking about the state level, maybe the federal level, like, especially for the workforce and things like that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So, we'll briefly talk, and I'll stay in for a couple more minutes. But really, Virginia is the economic hub where we have a lot of data centers. And when we look at those data centers, it's usually Micron, it's usually Facebook, and it's usually the big Amazons who have this here. And these are data centers for AI. And we have to look at it from the perspective of, yes, it's an economic boom. At the same time, how do we protect consumers? So right now, if you go on the internet, you'll see a lot of videos. You cannot tell which is real and which is not. So from a consumer protection point of view, I carried a bill, other senators and delegates carried a bill where the manufacturers, whether it's Gemini, Google, or ChatGPT, they should be responsible for making sure that there's a tag or at least a stamp that indicates that this is not real. The other aspect of all of this is, I personally want to regulate it from a consumer protection part. I do think AI is going to make our lives a lot better. And we at the state level have to say, if Amazon wants to have a data center of 25 acres, whatever it may be, it should come with X number of jobs that are going to be helping the local economy that the state could own. Whereas a lot of these companies are coming in and says, we're going to build these data centers that are for AI, and by the time we get these built within a year, there's only one job that requires us to have, who just oversees and presses the button. That's about it. So I think we're at a point where, how do we compete? Not only do we bring the jobs here, but how do we compete against those companies who don't necessarily bring all the jobs in the long run? You may have data centers where they'll bring 10 jobs, and then a year later they realize they can streamline the process because the models are changing. But there's the other caveat where somebody could call and say, hey, I'm such and such from whatever agency, and we opened up an application and all that. All of that could be AI generated. So our goal is to ensure that there's consumer protection. That's where I see this as. And of course, in the big, beautiful bill, they wanted to ensure that the state does not do any type of AI regulation for 10 years. That cripples us from really regulating, where every state is unique. Whether you go to Arkansas, Texas, Arizona to Virginia, every state is unique, that it requires their own policies with somewhat of a broader direction from the federal side, where they tell us you can regulate this in this direction on your own, versus don't regulate at all because we want to do all this on our end. And I can go on for a couple hours about this, but that goes into the Genius Act, which talks about cryptocurrency, which talks about how the Trump family is really benefiting from some of these policies. And I think they're setting this up so that they would continue to benefit after President Trump is out of office in a legal way, rather than saying they're committing any type of crimes. So at the state level, we have an obligation to put out policies to protect consumers, because outside of Northern Virginia, Richmond, and sort of the Charlottesville area, you go out there, it's a dead end. It's folks that don't have broadband internet. And here's the thing, we don't have broadband internet in all parts of Virginia or satellite. And somehow we want to advance all these AI models that are going to consume a lot of energy. And that's the other component, is that we have to be able to work with some of our utility companies and the state corporations to find what is the electricity component that's going to be required, and how fast can we build them. I could have thousands of data centers, but if I can't plug them into something, they're not going to work. Whereas another state could have policies that are set up to say, in order for us to allow these data centers, we require X number of jobs. We require certain funds, whether it's housing funds or educational fund, where the companies would have to dump in $100 million every 5 years. That would then go back to the community so that the cost in the Commonwealth is less. As a result of that, you get a data center, you get AI policies, and you get jobs that are going to work. So that's really where the state has to think
Yeah.
through. But the federal government wanted to say we're going to go ahead and cripple everything. And my piece, was really around the fact that states are different. They have to do what they need to do in order to say this works best for our Commonwealth. And I think these are the policies we should be doing. So yeah, with that, I really appreciate being on here and really
Yeah.
glad we can have these conversations.
I'm going to have you on at some point. We'll do a separate video on that. So I'll let you go, Senator. Again, I appreciate your time. You ever need anything, reach out. And really, just from the bottom of my heart, thanks for your public service, because that's what you're doing is public service. So keep it up. You got me. And if you need anything else, just let me know, man.
Will do. Thank you again. And thank you to everyone that's listening. All right.
Absolutely.